going to kickstart the process. What's clear is that adaptation has certainly taken its place beside mitigation in terms of equal importance. There's a key role of technology across both of those areas. 2007 has also seen a substantial amount of work undertaken in the area of finance and investment through our work with the World Economic Forum and, as Kathy mentioned, the World Bank's Energy Investment Framework. The UNFCCC has also had a financial flows initiative this year, which is focused on the amount of capital that's actually required. And of course, what all needs to be linked there is that we need to recognise, as panellists have made the points here, that national circumstances differ the world over. Our economies are structured differently, they perform differently, some are carbon intensive, others are less so. But the relationships, the trade relationships, the ways in which that is all going to hang together, we need that overarching international architecture to actually make that happen. So if we look at how do we actually attract private capital into this particular area, I think Fernando made the point that business and governments can perhaps even appear like they come from different planets or speak different languages. But what's clear, what this business sector has to do is to actually articulate in very clear terms what it actually means to make an investment decision, so that governments understand how and why a business chooses to invest in a particular investment decision. And Gail pointed out that that's not always easy, because in some cases the decisions are already made or already taken. The second point that we often hear is that recognising that in this day and age the world is getting richer, but if you talk to an IFI or a multilateral development bank, or even very much the merchant banks that are really starting, and investment banks that are taking aim at this issue, a lot of what we hear back is that raising money isn't actually the problem, but as Ivo said this morning, it's about actually directing that flow to places where it hasn't been before. And so then if you take the UNFCCC's perspective that something like 86% of the capital is anticipated to come from private sources, then it would certainly appear to make sense that you need to then align the policy framework with the way in which a business chooses to invest and goes about that decision making. So in terms of understanding how and why a business does choose to invest, you have to recall that those decisions are always made in a dynamic, highly competitive, differentiated marketplace. Every decision will rely on commercial returns, just like water flowing down the stream. Perhaps, Peter, the money always flows to where those quickest returns are. But what we actually need to do is to get that current actually flowing in the direction of cleaner technologies. We do know that low carbon projects and infrastructure projects are among currently the more complex or risky forms of investment. There are different screening mechanisms that are applied depending on whether you're a corporate trying to finance your own projects as perhaps CLP, or whether you're a Merrill Lynch taking aim at a debt equity provision for an infrastructure project. The reality is a lot of it will always come back to the net present value, the internal rate of return on that investment. Problem is, though, that that is a risk-adjusted IRR calculation, and the way in which members of the corporate sector undertake that risk adjustment analysis is not necessarily uniform depending on which sector you come from and what your overall appetite for risk is. So there are a whole range of risks that need to be taken into account, and that basically leads you to a point where a great opportunity for one investor may not necessarily be a great opportunity for another. We've talked about markets and the need to harness the power of markets. Political risks, legal risk structures all influence the pace of investment in the market. And in markets, confidence is important. It determines the number and the scope of potential participants in that market, and also the volume or liquidity in that market. And in this case, in carbon markets and GHG markets, policy uncertainty increases the risks of whether or not you're able to achieve a commercial return out of, say, for example, your carbon finance structure. So basically, while this uncertainty continues to prevail, it's pretty easy to make the connection that the bulk of private capital will almost certainly flow to traditional energy sources, or remain at least uncommitted until those policies arrive. So on policy, what's actually needed? And you've heard it fairly clearly today, but the policy effort at the international level must align, as far as we're concerned, with the long-range business investment horizon. And by that, a 5-year commitment period just basically isn't enough to actually achieve that. There needs to be supportive regulation and governance to encourage business to invest for the longer term. Dismantling of trade barriers, management of IPR issues so that innovation can flourish. And then we've also heard today about clear expectations or a strong expectation of a CO2 price. And quite clearly, the ultimate game here is to try and create a strong and reliable, predictable demand for the technologies that are going to be needed so that that actually drives innovation as well as participation. If we turn to developing countries, what do we believe that governments in developing countries can do? Certainly there's plenty that can be done to build their own institutional capacity, to translate energy and climate strategies that actually become integrated into their national development plans. And as Peter said, it's about getting climate and development on the same passage. We need stable and transparent regulatory regimes, a move beyond the current structure for the CDM, and maybe there's things developing countries can do to group projects into portfolios and standardise and streamline the process for investors. Importantly, I think it's important that we support small to medium-sized enterprises and those governments do that as well in their own countries, because they can also play an important role in developing their own energy-based projects and therefore helping with technological deployment. And then obviously I think that we also need technology cooperation through competitive business-to-business transactions that are taking place in those developing countries. I'm sure that there are many entrepreneurial businesses and project developers that are here in the room today that are actually taking those steps today in what is a risky environment, when in actual fact what we need is for businesses to basically be beating each other up, literally, in terms of trying to compete to get those types of projects done in developing countries. So there really needs to be an evolution of the amount of transaction activity. Kathy mentioned before where can we actually work together with the public and private sector. As you know, we've been involved in the G8 Gleneagles dialogue, and we've spent time over the course of this year with the World Bank, with the other development banks, trying to find out what opportunities there are, as Ivo said, to create some quite sophisticated new forms of financial engineering that will actually help deliver the types of projects that we're talking about. And Kathy mentioned the need to buy down the incremental investment costs and through grants, concessional loans, and other means and ways of improving the credit worthiness of the carbon cash flow through things such as partial guarantees. So a final slide to wrap this session up. It's clear, as Rudy said, that we do really need to get these technologies into the developing world. There's a clear expectation that rich countries need to help poor countries. Business has capacity to help, but it does need policy certainty that brings stability, confidence in the markets, and facilitates long-term investment decision-making. And I think most people in this room will agree that if we do get this right, it can be used to tick a number of boxes. We can get these instruments and policies to actually work to not only alleviate poverty and create jobs and build sustainable economies in the developing world, but we can do it in a way that reduces emissions, protects and conserves energy resources, and crucially also the world's ecosystems. So I'll pass you back, Andre.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. I would just draw the conclusion there's no simple solution, there's no soundbites, just a hard slug, and we need to change the supertanker's direction on a very short notice, and there's enough work for all of us that we can't really relax. I think it's just the work is starting. I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking the panelists for their contribution. And Adam. And now it's my pleasure to hand it back over to Claude, wherever Claude is. There he is. Okay, Claude, there you are.
Thanks, Claude. Thank you.
Can we have the next slide?
Are you headed?
I'd like to invite the next panel.